Welcome to our Turing-Roche Knowledge Share series. The aim of these monthly events are to bring together members of the Turing and the Roche networks and the wider scientific community to hear partnership updates, different perspectives on topics in data science, and build new connections. Just to kick us off, I'm just going to share some slides. Hopefully you can all see that. Yeah, so the clue is in the name. So just a bit of a background to a Turing-Roche partnership. It's between the Alan Turing Institute and Roche. I'm sure most of you will be familiar with at least one of these organizations, but just a bit of background in case not. So the Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. We're a convening body of university, industry, charity, and government partners. And the Turing-Roche partnership sits under our Health and Medical Sciences program, and Roche is our first pharmaceutical partner. Roche is established in 1896 as a leading healthcare company. They have a long-term interest in personalized healthcare, which is a topic of our partnership, and they also have a growing number of academic partnerships too. And we launched our strategic collaboration together in June 2021, and that's going to be going on for 5 years. And this is our kind of partnership North Star, so our kind of guiding aim for the 5 years. So ultimately, we're collaborating together to explore this term of patient and disease heterogeneity through advanced analytics. So why patients respond differently to treatment and why diseases manifest in different ways in different people. Obviously, this is quite broad, so we're tackling this through a stepwise iterative manner, which you can see illustrated on the right, with a main focus on developing methodology and focusing on different research themes, such as structure missingness and predictive modeling. And you can find out more about the partnership and our research themes on our Turing webpage. Our core partnership team is pictured here, and then this is also expanded out with researchers we've funded and Turing Enrichment students we've taken on. Again, more information on our webpage. And also a kind of key part of the partnership is the wider connections and collaborations we want to build. So it's really critical for us to be running events like this to get you all involved. So our theme for today is natural language processing in healthcare, which I'm sure you'll all agree is a very hot topic, and is also of interest to the partnership as we explore how research could make a difference in healthcare settings and as we work with clinicians more closely. It's also of interest to the Turing more widely, and I just wanted to flag that we have an NLP interest group at the Turing. I'll pop the link in the chat in a minute, but anyone is welcome to join that. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome our speakers today, Trisevgeni Papakonstantinou, who is a PhD student in UCL's Causal Cognition Lab, and Lucia Schmidt, who is a postdoctoral oral researcher in the data science team at Roche. As mentioned, we'll be hearing from both our speakers, and then we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. Again, doing this through the kind of Zoom Q&A function. Feel free to ask specific questions to individual speakers, or you can ask a question for both of them to answer. So with that, I will now hand over to Therese, if you're ready to share your screen.
Thank you, Vicky. Okay, are you able?
Yeah, it just needs to be made full screen, I think.
About that?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So thank you very much, Vicky, and thank you for the opportunity to share this work with you all. This is some work, a project that I've been working in the last couple of years in the larger context of NLP in healthcare, and it is presenting a human AI analysis framework tailored to qualitative research in healthcare. We have termed this framework mission-assisted topic analysis. So I'll start with some words on why this is required. So in digital health, specifically in public health services, there's a huge evaluation gap. This means that a lot of the publicly available apps and services have not been scientifically evaluated, and a lot of those who have been evaluated are no longer or never have been publicly available. So it is a very unregulated industry, which is certainly bad news regarding sort of adverse effects that is quite literally matters of life and death in many cases. And in this industry and in public health in general, user feedback is not integrated in time to improve those services when it really matters, if it is ever integrated at all. So there are good reasons why this is happening. So a lot of this sort of user feedback for this services is collected in the forms of surveys, reviews, and feedback in public health services. That is a lot of the time in long form free text boxes asking users what they like or dislike about the service, how can the service be improved, or what they found helpful or not helpful. And it is quite easy to sort of chuck this free text box on the sort of end of a survey or a view of a product. However, there are very little plans usually to analyze that data and actually use it to improve the product. It is much easier to focus on more structured data that is normally collected, like Likert style items. And these data often stay in the file drawer. There are vast volumes of them, and it is a very resource-intensive process to analyze that type of data. Of course, it involves a lot of time. It involves a lot of human resources to use sort of traditional qualitative analysis methods in order to gain insights from large volumes of free text data, and in order to then turn them into recommendations for service improvement. So what tends to happen is that researchers are employed to analyze only small subsets of those data sets, or focus on very high-level recommendations that are usually come too late. Because again, it takes a lot of time and resources that are not always found if the data are analyzed. It's usually in a time where adverse effects have already happened. It is usually in a time where we miss the dynamic of the environment changes. For example, the example of the pandemic is a very good one of that, where the circumstances changed week to week. So whatever sort of time lag was between the user providing the feedback and the feedback being integrated into any service was very crucial. So how can we start in sort of addressing this issue? One way would be to sort of harness the benefits of artificial intelligence and combine it with what human intelligence can provide. So in terms of a framework where we could dream of a collaboration between the two, we could get the benefits of speed and cost effectiveness from the recent advances in natural language processing, which have also been proven to be quite accurate in terms of the insights they provide, and combine it with the synthesis, meaning-making, nuance, and context that human oversight brings. So I want to propose a framework that we have been developing in the last couple of years that does exactly that. So we have termed this, again, machine-assisted topic analysis, and it involves these 5 steps that I'm going to outline very briefly. Again, the first one is that of data collection. This is usually not an issue because, as I mentioned, there are vast amounts of data that have been collected around those issues that just sit in the file drawer, never analyzed. However, there are lots of other types of data that this could be applied to, such as social media data, which are again freely available sources of feedback and user experiences that could be employed to improve those services. The second step is to go through a procedure of pre-processing this data so as to make it useful to a natural language model. And that involves, I will not go into as much detail, different methods of cleaning the text and making it meaningful for the model by tokenizing, removing stop words and stemming so as to make it a bit more uniform. Then the third step, and this is sort of the core of this method, or rather the first core part, is applying a topic model. So for those of you who might not be familiar, a topic model is an unsupervised machine learning method that can be used to infer latent themes into a corpus of data. So it has the assumption that a corpus consists of different topics, and then each document, which in this case would be a piece of user feedback, for example, is then representative of a topic. It belongs to one topic. So then the topics are inferred in a bottom-up manner and then mapped onto the data set to sort of group the different observations together into one topic. Specifically in this framework, we use a model called structural topic model, and this allows the inclusion of covariates in the model that can help us then gain insights by looking at subgroups in our data and topic prevalence in the different, for example, demographic groups. The output of this model is where the sort of human part of this framework comes in. So the output that we use in our framework is of two types. The first one is what the model itself understands as the topic, which is basically a distribution of tokens or words in this instance. That is basically the sort of frequently occurring ones for those topics for those documents, where there is high prevalence of the specific topic. And the second type of output is the representative quotes. So quotes where the topic that we're looking to evaluate has the highest prevalence in. So in the qualitative part of this, the humans take this output and sort of start with interpreting the meaning of the topics themselves. So going through a process of trying to label and find out what the different quotes in this topic have in common. So what is the topic about? And also in our framework, we follow a process of the traditional thematic analysis, sort of mimicking all the steps in that procedure in order to create those larger high-level themes that might span across topics as well and summarize the data in a more meaningful way. And finally comes a step of service improvement, is where we use the insights that we gain from this analysis to provide some high-level recommendations for the actual improvement of the service according to the user feedback. So now I want to walk you through some of the applications of this framework where we have worked on in the last couple of years. And the first study that we did was very much a proof of concept for this framework. While working in Public Health England, it was then my colleague, Paulina Bonderonek, who leads this work, and I were tasked with analyzing tens of thousands free text responses of dissatisfied users with the NHS Test and Trace service in order to provide recommendations for improving the service and making it more user-friendly. This was obviously an impossible task for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So we experimented with a few different frameworks and we landed in this one. And I'm going to just very quickly show you the results of that project. So we were able to harness some much more nuanced insights actually than what we originally expected. And we were able to sort of group them into three main themes of issues the users were facing. So very quickly, just to demonstrate the sort of output that you can get from this method, I'm going to walk you through. So the first one was users facing issues with receiving too many contacts and incompatible contact methods. And this is the sort of what I call a theme. So the larger sort of human-generated theme and the topics that you can see here more granularly at what the model sort of generates, and then the humans interpret and label. So you can see sort of different variations of the same issue that has been faced by users. Same with the second theme, we turned too late. So you can see conflicting information about isolation dates. Users were already self-isolating and then contacted again. So again, different sort of more nuance and context-specific variations of the same issue. And then the third one talks about more technical issues with the service and the application itself. So I'll move on in the second study. After that, we wanted to see if we are able to sort of generalize this framework and apply it to get insights from diverse sort of data sets. But we also took the next step to sort of validate it and see how it compares to a human-only traditional qualitative analysis. So in this case, we had a lot less responses, and this was free text responses from users of the German Defense website, where again, they were asked for feedback of what they found helpful and not helpful in the website. And we followed a parallel human-only traditional qualitative analysis and our MATA framework separately and blinded from each other. And then we followed a process of a formal triangulation of the two. So here are the results of that. And this is the triangulation table. So you can see some of the codes and themes that we generated through this analysis. And there was a very, very high level of agreement between the human-only generated codes and the MATA codes that you can see on the right. So most of them were in complete agreement with the human analysis, but also we were able to generate some additional insights in the complementary codes that you can see here. As we it was a different, of course, sort of method of analyzing. However, we were able to triangulate it. And the sort of more key part here, as we were able to do a comparison of the resources and person hours used in each of the methods of analysis. So you can see we had significant time and resource savings using the MATA method, and we're able to come to a very similar output and result in the human than the human-only method. And the third application is the most recent one. And we wanted to see if we can sort of harness this more automated approach by taking the data set that is not created through a survey, but rather take free text data that is publicly available on social media, and see if we can use it as a source of user feedback for evaluating digital health apps. So in this case, we focused on the 5 most popular period and fertility apps in the UK and the US. And we wanted to see if we could apply this analysis method to the framework of social media listening in order to improve those services. So again, this is a sort of slightly different type of data. It's a lot shorter than what you would usually find through the free text boxes that free text responses that are generated through surveys. So it was a challenge. It's a lot more of a noisy data set, let's just say. But nevertheless, we were able to apply this framework, and we were able to gain insights on a lot more than the more technical issues that are usually presented through the surveys or through the reviews of users. And we were able to get insights on discussions that were a lot more about the social cultural, the social political context within which those digital health interventions are situated. And we got a lot of interesting results around the role of those tracking apps as discussion forums, the role of them in the user's life, some of the behavioral and emotional impact and intertwinement of technology and humans. So again, a very interesting application of that. And we were able, again, to gain insight. Of course, the caveat with this sort of method is that we are not able to go into as much depth and gain as much nuance as a human analysis would do in the sort of traditional qualitative methods. We lose a lot of the individual perspective. So this method is usually only able to harness to talk about any major issues that are repeatedly mentioned by users. And the context that human oversight brings comes later in the process and is not involved in the categorization step of the analysis as it would in a human-only beginning to end analysis. However, we are able to use this method to provide a timely analysis when it is needed most, especially in cases of public health emergencies. And we are able to gain those high-level insights and recommendations that would prevent some of the adverse effects. We are able to get to those low-hanging fruit without investing as much time and resource. And we have also seen that it is a generalizable framework for different types of data. And we can harness it through a lot of different applications, whether that is structured survey feedback, whether user feedback in the form of surveys, whether that is maybe interviews in the future, or different types of social media data. So with that, I would like to thank my collaborators, especially Dr. Parina Bondaronek, who has led this work. And thanks to all of you. Back to you, Vicky.
Thank you so much, Therese. That was fantastic. I will now hand over to Lucia. Just a reminder that you can ask any questions in the Q&A box in the bottom bar. And we will get to them after Lucia's talk for both of our speakers.
Thank you, Vicky.
Perfect. Yeah, I think you just need to do full screen and then you're sorted.
Okay. Am I sharing it now?
Yeah, you just need to minimize the notes box. It's just hovering on the top left.
This one?
Yes, perfect. That looks good.
I was kind of hoping I could see that, but that's fine.
I think you can put it on another screen if you have it.
No, only one today.
Oh, okay.
So thank you, Vicky. So as Vicky said, I'm Lucia Schmidt. I've been working as a postdoc in data and analytics in research and early development here at Roche. And my focus has been on the use of NLP methods to study social media listening to collect patient insights. I'll be talking about that today. So, as a bit of background, in the drug development cycle, there are many stages where we actually need patient information in order to not only understand if there are adverse events once a treatment is in the market, but also in the early stages, just to understand if there's a need for a specific treatment, if there's something that the treatments available are not actually doing for the patient, and in the middle stages, in order to determine what are we going to measure in the clinical trials in order to understand if the treatment is actually effective for the patient, not because there is a big disconnect in what the patient perceives are important and what we like healthcare providers believe is important. There's usually agreement, but the priorities are different because it has a direct impact in their quality of life. Now, there are a variety of methods in how we collect this information already, like interviews, surveys. Most of these, we just go directly to the patient and caregivers or healthcare providers, and we ask them specifically a set of questions in order to understand the challenges they face. Most of these methods have a lot of drawbacks. In general, they are quite expensive, not just in money, but also in terms of time, because there is recruitment processes involved that are quite lengthy. They do place burden on the patient, and in some cases, the burden is quite high, which limits the amount of people that will participate. Because of cost, we usually have to limit the scope. We cannot do very complex studies because we cannot recruit 1 million people. And as any methodology, they come with biases in the selection method, in the information the patients remember at the time they're sharing information, in what they're willing to disclose, because some of them they're not willing to share personal or embarrassing information with a stranger, which is perfectly understandable. And as a complement to these traditional approaches, we have what we call social media listening, where we go on social media and passively monitor what the users are publicly sharing online. What we do is basically, we don't interact with the patients, we just see what they share. But this means that we have no recruitment. So immediately we eliminate any kind of burden on the patient. The patients are already online sharing information because they go to these disease-specific communities because they need support, they need information, they need this feeling of other people understanding their struggles. So we don't have to ask them, they're already there. It's just a matter of us using the appropriate tools to collect the information we need. Because it's social media, we are also looking at potentially very large cohorts of patients. Like the limit is in the data already. If we are talking common diseases, we're talking thousands of patients. Rare diseases is a bit more challenging, but it's possible. We have access, of course, to real-time data. We've seen it with COVID and long COVID. Like most of the symptoms have been reported on social media before actual clinical studies were published. So if there's anything new happening, it's very easy to collect it from social media, particularly if it's happening on a large scale. And last but not least, I think it's the most important thing, we collect information straight from the patient's mouth in their own voice. We understand the struggles the patients face, the unmet medical needs they have in their own words without us influencing in any way how they share the information. If they constantly repeat and complain about a specific symptom, it's because it significantly affects their quality of life. And this is a good way to measure what is important to them. Now, as you can see, slowly, like the drawbacks from the traditional methods slowly disappear. It does leave us with like a hard burden on the researchers, which one could argue is basically the expected work on less researchers, because you don't actually need that many people to carry out social media listening study. You just need a couple of NLP experts. Now, that's not to say social media listening doesn't have issues. We still have one significant one, that is, we still lack scientific acceptance. That's why social media is a complementary approach to traditional methods. Like no decision will ever be done just on social media data alone. We always verify and compare with any other real-world data source we have, because there's only so much social media can measure, and there's no significant way to verify what we're missing offline. And we also have the issue of regularity to support. in the last couple of years, this has been changing. Like regulatory agencies all over the world, like the FDA, the European Medicines Agency, not only are requiring companies to provide patient involvement in the drug development process, but they are also to explicitly mention social media as a valuable source to collect this information. This is aside from the standard NLP issues we face with the text. Social media is a special kind of text. It's like the most noisy, most complex kind of text we'll be analyzing because misspellings are common. We're lucky if we have grammar. The patients usually talk about their disease in layman language, so like ontologies not necessarily work in some cases. We have to deal with multilingual language or users who speak multiple languages and are not speaking in their native languages because the only available forum is in English, for example. We have missing information. There's like no way to verify the truthfulness of the user statements. As far as we know, they could be lying. There's no reason for them to, but there's no way to verify it as you would in like the traditional approaches. And of course, we deal with noise, sparseness, activity imbalance. Like there's a lot of issues with social media data, but with appropriate techniques, they are manageable. Now, a traditional approach for the standard pipeline for social media listening starts with the first step, finding where are we collecting our data. That means going online and searching for relevant sources. What we mean by sources, we mean like ideally disease-specific forums, because it means we have a lot of information. Users generally share their entire patient journey there. It also reduces immediately the amount of noise. A disease-specific forum most likely will have patients with a specific diagnosis. We also look at Reddit in those cases in specific disease subreddits. Worst case scenario, if there are no disease-specific forums, we used to look at Twitter, I guess X nowadays, which is possibly just involves different levels of work, because first you have to find the users, you have to filter out the noise, and then you have to collect more information because usually a tweet is not enough to actually get the whole patient journey. Once we have the list of sources we want to analyze, we have to go through terms and conditions because not all platforms are the same. We cannot collect indiscriminately from social media. Some platforms are private, some have specific rules against it. So we have to be very careful of what we use and what we don't. And once we have a curated list, of course, we collect everything we can in order to process it in the next stages. It is important to mention that when we talk about social media, we are talking about public, open social media platforms. So if we have to create an account in order to see that information, for example, Facebook and Facebook groups, those are immediately out of the set of platforms we can use. It's a bit disappointing in terms of data availability, but we don't want to enter private spaces and like collect information from users that are not willing to disclose it. It has to be public. And it's also important that we don't enrich it beyond the platform itself. Like we don't try to find the users on Twitter and other platforms in order to get more information from the users. In fact, in some cases, we even pseudo-anonymize the data in order to potentially eliminate sensitive information. And of course, as any correct method, like we store the data in like password-protected environment with all the considerations. Once we have our data, we collected a huge amounts of posts for a specific disease. We always have a second step where we consider the whole. This is where we, kind of like a clinical trial, we try to establish what are the inclusion or exclusion criteria we're going to use in our population in order to define the limits of the study. This is not necessarily an essential step in all specific studies. In some cases, we don't particularly care about specific population, but in some cases, it's essential. Particularly, for example, in the case of mental disorders, it's very important to verify the diagnosis because it's very common on mental disorder social media platforms to have a lot of users who believe they have a disease but don't exactly have a diagnosis. And if you want to do an accurate, rigorous study, you need to verify this. We're looking also at demographics, for example. In some cases, we care about some ages more than others, or we want to do an age comparison like further on, which means that we have to extract that information. The important thing at this stage is that we don't use models that infer information about the user. We use models that extract information explicitly from the text. If a user is removed from the cohort, it has to be because they explicitly mention something that makes them to be excluded from the set of patients we care about. So like they mentioned they have a comorbidity we don't want to consider, or they mention the age is outside the range we want to consider. There are a variety of tools that we can use on this stage. It depends on the characteristics we need to consider. It could be as simple as the use of regular expressions. It could be, in some cases, using ontologies to map two diseases, for example. It could be more complex machine learning approach like name entity recognition or classification, or some kind of hybrid mix of any combination of the previous. The important thing here is that regardless of the methodology chosen, regardless of how accurate the methodology was in the past, like if we had a model that has a performance of 0.98, for example, like 98% accurate at a classification task in the past, the moment you change the data, the social media platform or the disease, the accuracy can change widely, because the vocabulary in different diseases is widely different. And not only that, like social media platforms have different conventions on how the patients communicate and talk about the disease. And this change in vocabulary has a significant effect on the performance of the different models. So you always need to take a stop here, grab a sample, and verify that it's working as you expect it to be working. Sometimes it works better than you expect. Sometimes it works significantly worse, to the point that you have to come up with another strategy. Now, when we have extracted our patient population, we go to the actual core of the study, and this is where we try to answer the research questions. Again, it varies widely from study to study. In general, we're looking at symptoms and quality of life. For symptoms, it's usually pretty straightforward. We have ontology and models that automatically extract it from the text. Quality of life requires a bit more care. It usually involves a bit of exploratory analysis to understand how the patients are talking about their quality of life. And it usually requires some manual work to validate any kind of methodology you apply, like topic modeling, to ensure that it's working as expected. This is the interesting part. It really actually requires you to get to know the data, because it's never as clean and never as straightforward as you think. There's always noise that you don't expect. There are always specific clusters within the communities that you never expect to be there. But once you extract your features, we go to the final step, and this is where we compare to any other real-world data source we have. We can look at the literature to validate our results. We can compare with claims data, insurance data. We can look at other patient-reported outcomes. The important thing is that if the methodology was validated before, we can quantify the results and actually do significant comparisons, statistical significant comparisons with other methodologies. And in general, I mentioned it before, social media listening doesn't really introduce nothing like significantly new to the disease. We're not discovering the wheel here. You usually complement what we know, like we verify what we know. We discover usually these lower signals that when you have recruitment in the middle and the sample is much lower, you kind of miss. So we have new symptoms that are less statistically significant. You have some rare conditions that appear that you were missing before. You have some perspectives that some real-world data types fail to capture, like treatments that are not captured by insurance, for example, where they buy online or go to another country to buy. And more importantly, as I mentioned before, it allows us to reevaluate what the patient considers important. Like we agree on what's there, but what the patients, the priority of the patients are usually very different to the priorities of the healthcare providers. And you can notice that just by looking at the frequency of the complaints they have in terms of symptoms, in terms of quality of life impacts. If you're going to take anything away from this presentation, it's basically three things. Number one is that while it's still not, it doesn't have the scientific acceptance as the traditional methods, social media listening is still slowly gaining regulatory support as a viable method to complement these approaches. When the traditional approaches fail because recruitment is hard or impossible because we're talking rare diseases or populations that are very hard to reach, like underage patients, patients with mobility issues, patients where the disease burden is so high that the idea of them participating in any kind of study is unthinkable. Social media listening is usually a very good alternative to collect more information. And finally, it enriches whatever patient insights we have because it does gives us more context and it allows us to see the disease from the patient's perspective without any kind of influence from external factors. And that's about it. Thank you, everyone. And if there's any questions, I think we can go back to Vicky.
Thank you so much, Lucia. That was great. I will just stop. Yeah, perfect. Great. So we've got about 20 minutes for Q&A now. I can see there's some questions in the Q&A box, which I'll go through now. Also, feel free in the reactions bar, you can also raise your virtual Zoom hand. So if you'd like to ask your question in person, then you're very welcome to do that as well. But I will get started on the question box whilst we're waiting. So the first question for Tris, please could you quickly explain again the SDM model that was used? Also, did the model just create clusters of topics or did it also provide those category names that we saw in the examples, such as proof of concept and validation?
Thank you for this question. The SDM model is the structural topic model implementation in R, the SDM package. So that is, again, a traditional topic model that also includes, you're able to include covariates that are mapped onto the topic prevalence. It only creates the clusters of, not exactly clusters of topics, but rather clusters of documents, each of which is a topic. It doesn't provide the category names. So this is something that the human sort of component of the analysis is for, sort of the interpretation that follows a process of how can we find what those documents or quotes have in common. And that is usually what the topic is about and how we go about labeling it. I hope I answered the question.
Great, thank you. The next one for Anna, Lucia, how are you able to collect tweets? Is it through the API? I'm curious if academic access still exists for researchers without paying thousands of dollars for the regular subscription.
Well, I mean, currently we're no longer using Twitter because this, as you said, you have to pay a ridiculous amount also for a very limited amount of content. We used to do it through the API before. If you still want, I mean, there are academic resources that have like the historical Twitter dump that you can download. Like there's still significant resource available, but it's no longer a live collection. It is what it is now. We're hoping like whatever replaces Twitter will still be as open.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you've kind of like found other social media. I feel like nothing has really replaced Twitter at the moment, but if there was anything else on your kind of radar.
I mean, not yet, but honestly, in terms of like the way we do the studies, Twitter is usually the last, was the last kind of resource, because you do have to deal with an incredible amount of noise and false positives. Because basically, I don't know if anyone's familiar how it used to work. Basically, you connect to the API and it's like you're fishing in a stream. You get like used to get like 1% of the global tweets. And you can put a filter on top of that, but if you put a filter, you don't know what's missing. It's a bit of a lottery in that sense. And again, you only get 140 characters initially, then a bit more. Forums are much more rich in terms of information because the patients know what's important to share in the community to get proper advice.
Did you find the same when you were doing it for the period tracking apps? I guess that was maybe a while ago.
It wasn't actually, it was quite recently, just before that happened.
Yeah.
Yes, very much the case. It was very, very tricky data to work with for many, many reasons. It was hard to get, it was hard to clean, hard.
Yeah.
Great. I mean, not great, but useful to know. Cool. Next question for Therese. Thank you for a great presentation. Racial and cultural bias has been documented in many NLP techniques. This can be especially important when looking at health data because of institutional racism and cultural biases that may already exist in healthcare and among those experiencing poor social determinants of health. When doing your analysis across surveys and social media, did you account for this? And if so, how?
Thank you for this great question. We did try to, I think, not racial, but we did include, I think it was IMD covariates in the original study. Of course, the model and the NLP technique is as good as the data. You feed it, and that is very much the case, that all those biases do exist in the data. There is not much we can do about that, but we are hoping that through this framework, we're mitigating part of the NLP bias and part of the human bias. We're hoping that they sort of cancel each other out, giving some more objectivity from the model, and then allowing the human oversight on top of that. We are hoping that this method does mitigate some of the bias compared to more traditional methods. Of course, that is almost impossible to measure, but we do try to include those covariates and sort of look at the topics to gain more specific insights for those populations. But again, there's a lot of work that needs to go into that.
Lucia, so I didn't know if you wanted to comment, because I thought I was kind of struck by that in your talk where you were saying there's maybe less bias because you're not kind of selecting which patients you're interviewing and things like that. Do you feel like?
I mean, there's always a bias in the methodology of the selection of the patients, right? Because we are, I mean, social media listen means we are dealing with patients that are on social media. We're missing everyone that's offline immediately. In some platforms, there are biases in terms of age, also in gender in some cases. But the thing is, because we don't try to use models that infer the demographics, that one, like, we want explicit measure, we can adjust the population, like the population, to be representative if we wanted to. Because it is possible to grab some posts and look at them, and like even a human annotator will say, I'm pretty sure that this is your age and this is your sex. But unless it's explicitly stated, we decide, okay, they have to say it. Otherwise, you can never guess. You lose a lot of users along the way in that, but because you start usually with a very big number, you still end up with a good number to do an analysis.
That makes sense. The next question for you, Lucia, is how do you feel about the honesty and transparency when people share details in social media? First talking to a medical specialist, e.g. kind of about embarrassing symptoms, age, etc. I think you did mention you felt it would kind of be more honest than the interviews that you were kind of taking part on.
It depends a bit. There are multiple factors there. There's always a cultural component, like different cultures have different levels of taboo talking about certain topics. So that plays a role, but that's harder to verify, so you never know how much it is. Honestly, I was surprised the amount of information people are willing to disclose when they're anonymous online. Because the patients, particularly when with serious diseases, chronic diseases, where there's no clear treatment that gives them like full relief, like improves their quality of life 100%, they share everything because they feel like I need to share everything in order to get actual help. And it's much easier to share it when you're anonymous. When we're talking controversial topics, for example, COVID, then it's a bit more tricky, because the moment like a topic is more polarizing, it's more likely for like fake news to start emerging. But when you're talking like common diseases, specific like rare diseases, it's very rare for people to be dishonest about that. If they are, I don't think it's statistically significant. But again, there's no way to check that.
Teresa, I wondered if you wanted to comment on that as well. I was just, again, thinking about the period tracking apps. Like, I wonder if people, I don't know, I feel like that's an interesting one. People might be more honest on social media, but also might be less honest. Yeah, I don't know, or any other thoughts you kind of have around that topic?
For the app specifically, I don't think we face a lot of these issues because it's not maybe as personal as a disease someone is living with. So a lot of times, as Lucia said, there's really no reason for people to lie about it. It's a lot of, trying to get into the mindset of someone who goes to Twitter to comment on a fertility app. They might be frustrated about a feature. They might, be happily reporting on an experience where the app has been helpful. So there's usually that part of sort of emotional component to it, and it's usually more sort of incoherent, especially with Twitter comments. But yeah, people do tend to be quite transparent about it and quite funny at times. Like there's the sort of witty aspect of it as well. Yeah, I think it's quite different in that sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. For the next, I think I kind of might tie two questions together here. So Lucia kind of mentioning using social media listening in terms of kind of hard to reach patient groups, potentially kind of underage patients or patients who aren't mobile. So they can kind of completely see the usefulness, but kind of thinking around the kind of ethical implications here. I think particularly this is something that struck me, that although these patient forums might be open, I'm interested how much kind of patients are aware that people can access this data and kind of mine from it. So if there's any kind of thoughts about regulation, I think the other question that's come in is quite similar about kind of, infiltrating kind of groups that people perceive as private to kind of gain information, and whether you've kind of had any feedback on that and things like that.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we don't try to infiltrate, we explicitly try not to infiltrate rules because it does feel like you're violating like an agreement that this is private and we don't share it. Because if there's a closed group in Facebook, like immediately, okay, they're patients, they don't want anyone else. Pretending to be a patient to get access is not exactly correct. In the case of underage patients, usually you don't get it from the patients, you get it from their caregivers, like their parents. It's much more common for the parents to go online to get support, advice on how to deal with it. Particularly support, because in some cases the burden is quite high and they need this sense of community to understand. Like, they're not the only ones going through with this. I mean, the implications are always there. You just need to be very careful on how we're dealing with information. That's why we always collect the minimal amount of information possible. We collect the text, but for example, you don't want to go outside the disease forum, like in Reddit. We don't collect their entire history. We just focus on exactly what they're sharing about the disease. In terms of is it public or not, that's why, honestly, we really like Reddit, because immediately it's in the terms of agreement, they expect you to be anonymous. So there is already an implicit agreement of anonymity there. And any analysis we do is still aggregated by the population, right? We never target specific patients. Even when we put examples, you provide them, so it's not an exact match. So you cannot just Google them. But yeah, there's always a consideration, like, are we in agreement with the GDPR? Are we doing everything correctly? So that one is always a concern. And the interesting thing, there's been a study, I cannot remember the name of the author yet, where they ask, I mean, it changes depending on the context. If you ask generic users if they might be monitored online, most of them will say no. But when you go to specific patients with like chronic diseases that still had unmet medical needs, most of them are okay with us like looking into what are their concerns, because they feel like if I'm sharing this and you're listening and actually doing something about it, it will improve my quality of life. Which, I mean, makes sense, because most of these communities sometimes emerge because they don't feel heard by healthcare providers.
Sorry, no, I was just finding the unmute. No, I think that makes lots of sense. Yeah, particularly around that kind of, particularly maybe potentially posting on the forum, because like you said, there's kind of unmet needs that the healthcare provider's not providing. Therese, is there anything you wanted to mention on that? Fine, if not.
It brought to mind a study, again, I don't remember whose study that was, but they asked sort of the general population, I believe it was mostly based on Reddit, about why, if they think researchers have infiltrated their forums and listening to them. And most of them thought that yes, that is the case. So I think there is a general awareness of people that research is being done on that data that they share online, and they are aware of it when sharing it. So I think that might apply here.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It's also really cool that in some communities, they're so on top of like the new research that they immediately share anything published about that disease. Because any research on their disease is relevant for them.
Yeah, definitely. I think like you said, with chronic disease and things like that, you almost find the patients.
Yeah, those are the cases
experts.
where the patient becomes an expert and like they stop using layman language because they really know.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. I think we've got one more question in the box, and I think we've got about 5 minutes to go. So just a question about how do you kind of filter for bots when working with kind of social media?
I mean, it depends on the source. In some cases, it's pretty straightforward because it's usually copy-paste text. Like the pattern is quite obvious immediately. It's also in terms of looking at volume. Like if you see a lot of repetitive posts from a user, it's quite fast to eliminate it. It's a bit more complicated on Twitter, I guess, but that's also why we avoid it because there's a lot. There used to be a lot more bots there. I don't know now. But that's why I mentioned one of the issues like activity imbalance. Most of the studies we do, we try to normalize on a user level. Like, so we don't want to look at just posts or mentions. We want to see, okay, people. And that way, if you have a user that posts 10,000 posts, even if it's a bot, immediately it's just one bot. So if there's a pattern, it will emerge immediately. It's a good way to see, like, you don't even need to look at the content. Usually just the numbers tell you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. We've probably got a couple of minutes if anyone wants to pop any kind of last minute questions in the Q&A box. I might just ask one really quickly for Lucia. I was interested about which diseases you're kind of pursuing for these kind of methods. I'm guessing they kind of come from Roche priorities, or are you kind of just doing a kind of broad look at kind of certain ones?
I mean, there's been a variety. It changes depending on what requests we get. Some of them are like quick questions, some of it's not so much. Usually we're looking at, like I mentioned before, these cases where traditional approaches don't work so well, like rare diseases. Or like the example of mental disorders where, for example, social anxiety, it's not that the patients are not there, it's just one of the highest barriers you have in order to get to the patient is the disease itself. Like you cannot expect the patient to answer the phone and like complete an interview when they're just like the disease gives them anxiety when they do that. So this is like a good way to bridge that gap.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. And Therese, I guess yours has been used for a kind of like a variety of methods, from kind of COVID to period tracking apps. Like, is there any other areas you're kind of looking at to pursue next, or?
So there's been quite a bit of interest in that method from different groups, especially from our network that has worked around COVID. So a few different sort of services that were implemented and data collected in that period that we're looking and are in the process of analyzing. And in terms of the social media data, we are also looking at the most popular fitness apps and most popular sleep and mental health apps. So that is ongoing research on next areas.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I can't see any questions for now, so I will keep us to time and draw us to a close there. Thank you so much, both for your fantastic talks. I felt like they were really complimentary, and we got to see a kind of how NLP can be used kind of across the whole system.